Hey guys, it's Ashton Bingham, and welcome to another brand new widget tutorial from MuseThemes. Today we're looking at Pushy Panes 2.0, which is a complete rebuild from the ground up of our original Pushy Panes widget. If the widget is new to you, Pushy Panes is a versatile tool that allows you to add slide-in panels to your website using custom state buttons and a variety of customization. You can place just about any content you want inside custom-built panes, and it pops into view triggered by a button and can be transitioned from any direction on the page. It can also be set to push or cover your page content, so it's pretty cool. It's mostly used for navigation menus, tooltips, contact areas, or even hidden footers and headers. The possibilities are literally endless, and we've completely rebuilt it for optimal use in responsive Muse. With this rebuild, we've also integrated all the functionality that our older widget VersaSlide had. After we built the original Pushy Panes widget as well as VersaSlide, Muse went through a lot of big changes with the addition of responsive layouts, and those changes really affected the fundamentals of how those widgets worked and impacted their performance. VersaSlide in particular was hit really hard. So rebuilding some of these more sophisticated widgets from scratch is really the only way to properly address the issues and ensure a solid performance. So let's migrate over to Muse. And I'm going to drag the widget from my library and drop it on the page like so. And right off the bat, you're going to see a handful of different elements included. Here we have the actual widget itself, and then we have a pre-built content pane already set up, which will save you some time. And then here we have a custom open button, and we'll get into the settings shortly, but with this widget you can use a default button styled within the widget settings, or you can create and style your own from scratch. Now, as it stands, this widget is already set for action. I can open up the settings panel and take a look at our first field, and this is where you enter the graphic style for your pane, and a style has already been entered by default titled pane. And we can select our actual default pane and look inside our graphic styles panel and see that pane is assigned here as well. As far as the button goes, we've included this custom button here for you to use if you choose. However, the widget comes preset to use a default button. So you can either use the default and remove this custom one completely, or simply change the setting in the panel to use this custom one or one of your own. And then just make sure you link it via a graphic style, which we'll cover shortly. But for right now, I'm just going to use the default. I'm going to remove this completely and give it a browser preview. And there we go. We see our default button here on the top left, and we can click it to reveal our pane. And of course we'd want to load in more content and do some color styling, but we're already functional right out of the box. Now if I hover over any of these navigation items, we're still seeing a text cursor, and that's just because these aren't linked to anything yet, but once you link these to pages, it'll function like a normal link. So back into Muse, I'm going to hit undo on my keyboard just to bring our custom button back. Perfect. Now let's talk about styling up our pane. It's always best to use a state button, just in case you're designing one from scratch. But with that being said, you can place literally just about anything inside of it just like you normally would. Just for fun, let me go ahead and grab the Muse Themes logo. And I'm going to place that on my page. And then just like a normal state button, all I have to do is drag and drop the logo right over the top of the button, and it'll get placed inside just like that. And you can of course go to town in regards to color styling, adding menus, contact forms, what have you. Now one thing I do want to point out, if you look closely at the way that our nav items are set up here, you'll notice that each button is actually a text box placed inside of its own state button. So what we've got here is basically several little state buttons resting within the one large encompassing state button of our pane. And there's an important reason to do this. The nature of a state button is to trigger the hover state of everything within the button at the same time. So if you're using this for navigation, you'll just want to be aware of that. If you just drop regular text into a state button, hovering over that state button will then trigger all of the text at the same time. So the trick is to use state buttons within state buttons, as we've done here, so that every piece of text has its own hover state in the browser. Now the default content pane here that you see when you drag the widget out is already set up like this. So if you're just going to be updating this existing one, then you're good to go. But if you're creating a new content pane from scratch, it's just something you want to keep in mind. So let's now jump into our settings panel and look at our styling options. First field, as I mentioned, is our graphic style for the pane. This can be anything you want, it just has to match the graphic style that you create for the pane. Now the second option is pane transition style. You can set this to cover all the content on your page or to actually push all the content over. And then page transition direction, pretty straightforward. You can have it come from the top, bottom, left, or right. And then the transition easing gives you a bunch of different ways that you can have the pane animate out. Next is our pane width and height. Now you can set the unit of measurement to either pixels or percentage, and then you set the corresponding value down here accordingly. For those of you missing VersaSlide, this is where you're going to achieve that functionality. Just set it to 100% and you'll be good to go. Pane background color you can set here. Now keep in mind this is only controlling the area outside of your state button. The state button itself has its own fill color settings, which you can apply directly to the state button. Now pane content position. This setting is important. This is where your content pane will appear within the large pane space when it's expanded. The pane space itself can vary in size quite a bit depending on the display size of the browser, especially if it's percentage based. This setting here sort of pins the content to a certain default position, and there's a lot of variability here. A lot of factors come into play when you're creating your content and placing it within the pane. Now the old Pushy panes, if you remember, had like separate parent and child elements. This setup here is a lot simpler, but it kind of offers the same versatility. You can think of the content pane here that you're styling as your child element, and the large pane space itself kind of as the parent element. Changing the size of the content pane, the position of the text, images, all that stuff will impact the look. So just keep this in mind as you design on your desktop, tablet, and phone sizes. Now this setting here is Enter Full Width Mobile Mode. This is a really cool setting that makes your panes full width at a certain browser size. And we did this because when you're using a 50% or a 25% width pane on your desktop, and then you shrink the browser down to a tablet or even a phone size, it's going to start looking really bad on mobile. So you can think of the number you're entering in this field as basically a breakpoint. If you're viewing the website in a browser smaller than this pixel width, your pane will automatically convert to be full width, which really optimizes this widget for mobile use. Display external page in pane. This is a really cool alternate function that's optional to use. It allows you to enter the link to one of your internal pages of your site, and the pane will then display that whole page in the browser. So for those of you that are looking for that previous functionality that VersaSlide offered, this is it. This allows you to design your pane content, navigation, whatever it is, on an entirely separate page in Muse, and then pull that in visually with the same Pushy pane function. So we just need to cover all the settings for our open and close buttons, and we'll start with the open button. Button type, of course, you can select default or custom. Now selecting custom will free up this graphic style field for you to link to your custom button. Now you may have noticed in our preview that the default button looked just like the default button that we had for VersaSlide. So I'm going to jump back to our preview for a sec. And the button is pretty cool as is, and it even has rollover and click animations. And it also even recognizes the direction of the pane with this arrow, and it'll automatically point towards the side where the pane is coming from. So back in the panel, we can style this up with icon and background colors for both the normal and active states. So let's say I wanted just a basic black hamburger menu. I could set the icon colors here to black and the backgrounds to transparent. And we'll preview it in the browser. And there we go. We now have a more subtle option, but still retains that cool animation on hover and click. Back in the panel again, default open button position type. Now this gives you basically two methods to place your open button. We have preset and manual. Now the preset ones are pretty straightforward. You have a long list of different ones to pick from here in this dropdown. But if you select manual, that opens up these percentage fields, and these kind of give you a more precise control over where the button is placed. So you have your percentage from top and percentage from left, and that gives you control over all four corners. So say you wanted it on the top right. You could set it 2% from top and 95% from left. So let's preview that. And there we go. And then with this percentage controlling, you can give this button a little nudge in any direction just by changing those fields, which is pretty cool. Now back in the panel under the open button, If we were to select Custom Button, of course, all of these default button settings will become grayed out. But then all we have to do is link our custom button with a graphic style. Now, a style called Open is already placed here automatically, so we can just use that. We can pop out of the Settings panel and then select our custom button, visit our Graphic Styles panel, and thanks to the pre-design of this widget, the style has already been linked. But before we preview, let's take a look at our Close button settings. Again, inside here we have Default and Custom. Custom, of course, you can design anything you want. Default, however, lets you control the color, and then these percent placement settings control the button regardless of default or custom. And then one more thing to keep in mind, all of these Close button settings will only be available if you're using a custom open button. Reason being is that if you're using a default open button, that animated button that we saw that's generated acts as both the open and close button. So these settings would no longer be needed in that case. So let's give this one final preview. And there we go. Our open button is functioning, and we get our close button placed here on the top left of the pane. So I think that should cover it. Thanks again, guys, as always, for watching. We're looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this rebuild, and of course, don't hesitate to give us a shout if you run into any difficulties. Thanks again.